Hi, everybody. This is Professor Testelin, and I will be teaching nutrition for nurses in the RN program. So welcome. What I wanted to do is kick off the course with recording Chapter 3, which is Digestion, Absorption, and Metabolism. And this will help enhance our lecture when we meet this week. It's important to note that the body's health is based on nutrients available for three components: for growth, for energy, and maintenance. The digestive system is responsible for quite a bit of functions, and those include processing foods. So that relies heavily on what we actually put in our bodies. Secondly, unless the nutrients from foods are not digested and absorbed, as you can see with maybe your own health or your family's health or your patient's health, health can deteriorate and disease will present itself. So as we go through each part of the gastrointestinal system, starting out with the mouth, esophagus, I want you to be thinking, critically thinking as nursing students, what could happen when something goes awry or something goes wrong in the GI tract? What symptoms are presented? What disease presents? Okay, so there's a lot of studies that show that the GI tract is the first line of defense to prevent disease, and the GI tract also will assist with immunity. For example, patients that have prolonged stress usually manifest itself in GI disturbances. So we'll see symptoms of constipation, diarrhea, GERD, which in turn can lead to more serious illnesses and diseases such as IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, diverticulitis, and GERD. We begin by showing that the main organs of the digestive system start in the mouth and end in the anus. The digestive system is a series of organs that utilize one digestive juices and enzymes that actually chemically break down the food and impair the ingested nutrients for digestion and absorption. These processes, so we go through ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination, depend on the integrity of the GI tract, the mobility of the GI wall, and the secretions of the digestive juices and the enzymes. I'm not a huge proponent of YouTube videos unless they're from reputable sites. And I will from time to time present short YouTube videos that get to the point. This is a great one regarding digestion, absorption, and metabolism. It's out from the University of Michigan in their medical arena. So when you get a chance, click on the video. It's probably like 6 or 7 minutes, and this kind of gives you an overview of the whole digestive tract. We begin our GI journey in the mouth with a mucus-like fluid called saliva. Digestion in the mouth is chemical digestion through the action of saliva, which is the enzyme salivary amylase. Salivary amylase will metabolize or break down starches. I want you to know examples of chemical digestion, which are the enzymes, and also mechanical digestion. So mechanical digestion is your teeth, your patient's teeth, the mixing, the churning of the food in the stomach. The tongue also gets involved, and it leads the pulverized food into the esophagus. So it moves that food into the esophagus. So all of this work creates what's called a bolus in about 5 to 7 seconds, and it reaches the esophagus. In the esophagus, we have involuntary movements of the muscles. It's called peristalsis. And these muscles move that bolus of food through the esophagus. We also have the churning action, which allows the secretions to mix with the bolus and breaking it down. So that churning, the peristalsis, this is an example of mechanical digestion. Segmentation is the forward and backward movement from the muscles that push the bolus through the GI tract. It next will end up in the stomach. But first, I have to tell you about this at the bottom of the esophagus. It's called the cardiac sphincter. And the cardiac sphincter prevents the acid reflux of the acidic stomach enzymes into the esophagus. So if the cardiac sphincter, or we've heard also LES, which is lower esophageal sphincter, what happens when this sphincter is not working correctly? So it doesn't remain closed and it basically opens and flaps back and forth. So now that strong acidic acid from the stomach reaches the esophagus, and that results in heartburn. Next, in the stomach, it's important to pay attention to the gastric secretions. So the stomach partially digests the food by combining it with these gastric secretions, which breaks the food down into smaller particles. We also have a hormone, which is called gastrin. It releases those gastric enzymes, which change as chyme. So the bolus changes into what's called chyme. It's C-H-Y-M-E. It's not pronounced chime, like ding dong. But chyme is a semi-liquid mixture of food mass, and that will pass through the duodenum, which is the upper part of the small intestine. So again, just to reiterate about the stomach acid, I want you to understand that it's extremely acidic. It's 12 molar hydrochloric acid. So again, we want that cardiac or LES sphincter to be working properly. The stomach also secretes what's called an intrinsic factor for vitamin B12 or cobalamin absorption. So most of the vitamins and minerals will be absorbed through the small intestine, with the exception of vitamin B12, because it needs that intrinsic factor, and that is where the stomach secretes it. There's also hormones that play an important role in the stomach, and it regulates the secretions. And this whole duration of gastric motility in the stomach is about 2 to 6 hours. Okay. As I mentioned, the upper part of the small intestine is the duodenum. The middle part is called the jejunum, which I want you to remember when we get to non-oral feedings with enteral tube feedings. That is one of the area that we will place a feeding tube. It's called a jejunostomy. And then the lower part of the small intestine is called the ileum. So this chyme moves through all parts of the small intestine in about 5 hours, because the digestive juices, now we get digestive juices flowing in from the pancreas, from the liver, and the intestinal small intestine mucosa, and they mix with that chyme. So that's really important for extracting those vitamins and minerals, which are going to be absorbed into the circulatory system. So let's look at that intestinal mucosa. That secretes what's called CCK. This may come back to you from anatomy and physiology. CCK stands for cholecystokinin, and cholecystokinin breaks down fat and protein. Now, the small intestine will prepare for absorption of these nutrients, macronutrients, which are carbs, protein, and fat, that the chyme holds, and also the micronutrients, which are the vitamins and minerals. So to sum up, the most important function of the small intestine is nutrient absorption. There's those thin layers of mucus that protects the walls of the small intestine from those digestive enzymes, because remember, they're extremely acidic. The walls of the small intestine also have these finger-like projections. Those are called villi and microvilli. And the villi and microvilli help to increase the absorption rate of the nutrients. Let's just touch on hormones and enzymes. There's a whole slew of hormones, like secretin, that actually send messages to the pancreas. Now, if you remember, the pancreas sends bicarbonate to the small intestine. Why? Well, bicarbonate is alkaline, and that knocks on the small intestine and says, hey, small intestine, we want to reduce that acidity content of the chyme so it doesn't digest the small intestine. The other one we talked about is CCK, cholecystokinin, and that acts as an antagonist or against gastric and pancreatic enzymes. And why is it an antagonist? Well, it knocks on the gallbladder and says, hey, gallbladder, I need you to release bile into the duodenum. Bile assists in digesting those lipids or fats. So here the chyme is absorbed and from the small intestine into the circulatory system. And now we're going to move on to the large intestine with two components, fiber and water. And that passes through the ileocecal valve onto the large intestine. So this takes about 9 to 16 hours, and later the large intestine is the final site of nutrient absorption. And here the large intestine will absorb water and some minerals. We also have to be concerned about bacteria in the large intestine. Now, there's some good bacteria that produce some enzymes, which in turn are absorbed because we need those. And then the next step for the large intestine is that feces are formed and excreted through the anal sphincter. So this whole process results in the ingestion and absorption of the macronutrients, carbohydrate, fat, and protein, and that's about at 95% of absorption. Absorption is a fascinating process by which substances pass through the intestinal mucosa into the circulatory system or the lymph system. There's different transport processes that you want to be familiar with, and they include passive diffusion, facilitative diffusion, and pinocytosis. So the different transport processes are a means by which nutrients pass through the walls of the small intestine. Passive, as the name implies, is a movement of substance from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. Okay, it doesn't require energy. That's why it's called passive. Facilitative diffusion is the movement of those molecules by a carrier protein. So it requires a protein to be attached. And again, you're going from a region of high concentration to where it's needed, where the nutrients are needed, that low concentration. Okay. Next, we have active transport. That's going to require ATP. As you remember from A and P, that requires ATP as that energy. So the movement is typically against some like concentration, constant gradient rather, in the body. So the examples that I'm going to give you is there's some type of pressure like fluid pressure, increased blood volume, maybe hypertension, and it pumps those substances through, but it requires that ATP. So when you're, say, riding a bicycle and you're going uphill, and if you're on like a 10-speed bicycle, you tend to shift down. So that's kind of like an analogy where you need that, or you pedal faster. So that is where that energy dependent ATP comes in. And then finally, we have pinocytosis. So if you can imagine in the cell, it's like a vacuole, okay? So it's kind of like a round vacuole that, how can I explain? It surrounds the substance. So substance can be fluid, it could be solid, it could be a nutrient. And the vacuole comes in contact with that microvilli or villi in the small intestine, and then it pushes its way through so it could be released into cytoplasm. And that's how pinocytosis works. Important here is the absorption from the small intestine. It's going to make it easy for macronutrients. So read chapters 1 and 2. The macronutrients are the carbs, protein, and fat. And micronutrients, which we'll get to in chapters 7 and 8, which is vitamins and minerals. So in terms of absorption, the body's going to determine where the vitamins and minerals are needed. Where's the carbs needed? Where's the protein needed? Where's the fat needed? So it's important that the small intestine is functioning properly for this efficient absorption to occur. And as you can imagine, diseases, for example, like IBS or IBD, irritable bowel disease, which affects small intestine and large intestine, Crohn's, colitis, their macrovilli and villi are short or flattened, and the absorption doesn't occur. So what factors affect absorption of nutrients? Well, for example, there's a strong relationship between bioavailability. So if your GI tract is functioning properly and you have the nutrients there and available, that's great. Then you're going to be a healthy individual. But as nurses, you're going to be working with patients who have decreased motility, decreased bioavailability. And there's a lot of malabsorption in a lot of these GI diseases. We also see certain medications will decrease. They'll bind, the medication will bind to specific nutrients and decrease the absorption. So they kind of fight for a place where the small intestine mucosa is to get into the circulatory system. Fiber's great, and we'll talk about it in carb metabolism next week. But dietary fiber, you have to be careful with certain medications. Fiber will block the absorption of certain medications, so we definitely need to look at that. So here, just so you can get an idea, the nutrients are truly in the body now, and they enter through the circulatory system, the lymphatic system, or the liver. So it's important to note what gets what. So the circulatory system, which is your general blood system, will get the macronutrients, the carbs, the protein, the fat, and most of the vitamins and minerals. The lymphatic system, and this is going to be important when we look at liver, gallbladder, and pancreatic disease, the lymphatic system will get large lipids and the fat-soluble vitamins. So all the nutrients end up in the cells. I mean, that's where we want them to be utilized. That's how we're going to remain healthy. The liver, however, we must note the liver is like the king organ, I call it, it gets priority of what nutrients it scoops up. And we'll see that later in degenerative diseases like fatty liver and cirrhosis of the liver, hepatitis. So elimination, as we end the GI system, is the expulsion or defecation of feces, not only feces, but bodily waste products. So think of it as like this residue. What can't be digested? Well, there's materials such as dietary fiber that include cellulose. We can't digest those, so those end up in the feces. Also, there's certain fats that are undigested, and they can combine with certain dietary minerals such as calcium and magnesium to form a residue. Additional component residues include water, bacteria, pigments, and mucus. So there's this big thing with the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, on dye in products, especially in children. There has been some connection with behavioral disorders such as ADD, ADHD. Those are what those pigments are. Typically, the body can't absorb most of it, but some does get absorbed. So like, for example, that red dye 40, the yellow dye, the blue dye. So keep in mind when you're looking, especially for yourself, some of the dyes are not going to be very friendly. And then lastly, mucus is also another residue that does not get absorbed. So this is a nice slide of a summary of the GI tract that we just went over, and you can find that in your textbook. So in lecture, we'll be dividing, depending on how many students we have, into 3 groups. And we're going to be looking at digestion and absorption of 3 food products. The first one's going to be a banana. Second is going to be a granola bar. And then the last one is a cheese and crackers. So typically when we're on campus, we'll go ahead and do those in groups. And I bring in the actual foods in, but we'll work on those remotely, and it'll be just as fantastic, I promise. So I will give you the worksheet and work with you in the groups, and those are posted in the module under week 1. And I want you to include both mechanical and chemical processes. Okay. So that kind of gives you a summary of looking at those pathways and how those food products are metabolized in the body. I want to touch on, we're going to be looking at basically patients throughout the whole lifespan, from infants to the elderly. We have digestive issues across the whole life cycle. Infants, when they're born, their GI function capacity is at 50%. So in the 30s and 40s, we see an increased incidence of, so when your patients enter, say you want to be an ER nurse, when you see patients in severe pain, doubled over, they're in their 30s and 40s, and you suspect GI issues, we see an increased incidence of gallstones, cholecystitis, peptic ulcers, typically secondary to stress. And as we age, the mucosal lining that we talked about in the stomach and small intestine, that diminishes as we age. We also see lactose intolerance as that lactase enzyme becomes more inefficient, or it lies dormant in some cultures. So nutrition, we're going to talk a lot about ethnicity. It's important that you tap into your own ethnicity and talk to your parents, or if your grandparents are still alive. That will enhance your whole process and understand a little bit more about nutrition and health. But going back to lactose intolerance, so certain cultures such as the Asian, African American, and Hispanic, some people, residents that are affiliated with those cultures, the lactase enzyme is dormant. So they experience symptoms of lactose intolerance, which include gas and bloating and nausea. As we age, also the lining of the large intestine becomes worn. And if you can think about, here's the large intestine, and then they have these like outpocketings, and that will lead to diverticulosis. And if it becomes inflamed, so if those pockets will then become inflamed with nuts or popcorn, the patient will present in the ER with acute pain and typically a fever. And also fiber. Fiber is a big thing because people don't really want to eat dietary fiber. Maybe it's, you'd rather have a donut, which is low in fiber, and refined sugars, which is the complete opposite of high fiber, which is complex carbohydrates. So we typically see a decreased intake of fiber, and all across the board, I have tons of patients who experience constipation. And as you get older, specific medications will also increase that incidence of constipation. I also want to touch on the two processes that absorb nutrients and are used by the body. So that's the whole main thing, is what we eat gets digested, absorbed, and then utilized by the body, those nutrients. For what? For energy. So you can study for your nursing courses. You could go to work, and if some of you work in healthcare facilities, you can stand on your feet for 12 hours. Also play with your family, or some of you may have furry friends as part of your family. So that's the main goal, right? To have a high quality of life. Examples of metabolism include two kinds, catabolism and anabolism. So catabolism, think of it as a breakdown. We'll talk about in carb metabolism in chapter 4, glycolysis. Glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose into energy, which ends up as acetyl-CoA. And so the cells and the tissues can utilize that energy. So that's breakdown. Anabolism is synthesis or repair. So when a patient fractures a bone, maybe their tibia, and we're repairing it with a cast, that's anabolism. We're building new muscle tissue. We'll talk about high metabolic stress later on in the course, and I'll talk to you about my experience with burn patients, third-degree burns. And so building that new muscle tissue in third-degree burns is also an example of anabolism. And lastly, I just want to leave you with the waste, thinking about where those waste products go, the ones that are not metabolized. They are going to be excreted through the lungs, through the kidneys, and the large intestine. So remember the pigments, the dyes, mucus, that sort of stuff. So we will look at metabolism across the lifespan. As you age, unfortunately, they say every decade your basal metabolic rate decreases by 2%. That's why when you get to like your 40s and 50s, you tend to, you'll see patients with abdominal or android obesity, they tend to gain weight. And we'll look at the nutrition needs of infants all the way through elderly. So not only is nutrition important, but what we call behavior modification or lifestyle changes that affect health, especially the GI tract. So that's including exercise and smoking cessation and all that other good stuff. So that is all I have for you for Chapter 3, Digestion, Absorption, and Metabolism. I will see you in lecture, and I hope this is helpful. Reach out to me with any questions or concerns, and I look forward to seeing you in lecture. Have a great day. Thank you.